Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 10 game from the Xtracon Open. Now, if you followed the round 9 video, you knew that I drew with white against another strong Grandmaster over 2600, and so it all came down to this. In the last round, I actually needed a draw with black to secure my second Grandmaster norm. And essentially, the reason I actually still needed a result is because my performance rating was something cruelly close to 2600, but not quite there. I believe my performance was like 2590 something. And, you have to have a performance rating of at least 2600 to get a GM norm. So I was right there, but not quite there. And that's why I needed still another result, another positive result. So my opponent in this one was actually someone I actually knew pretty decently by the name of Sune Hansen. Sune is one of the leading Danish chess players and has been so for, I want to say, 20 to 30 years. And doesn't play so much anymore. He's moved on to other things besides chess, but he's still obviously a very talented player. His peak was around 2600, but I believe at the time of this game, he was around 2550, 2560, so actually not very far off from his best days, which just suggests that he's still working quite vigilantly on chess. Now, yeah, I mean, I basically was in a really, tough spot needing a result. I knew he was going to go for my throat, and I didn't even bother, offering a draw early on because I knew that, he wasn't going to accept it. So I just was going to try and, play my best and see what happens. And, when you get into these situations, it's kind of important to step back and say, it's just a privilege to just put yourself in this position. So the fact that you've kind of put yourself in this position is, really all you can ask for, and then, you kind of have to live with the result. Another slight backstory before this, going into this game, is actually last year in the Xtracon Open, in Xtracon Open 2018, I actually also had a really great tournament and needed a draw in the last round to secure my second GM norm, and at that point, I was actually paired in round 10 with a white against Grandmaster Niels Grandelius, who was about 2680 FIDE at the time. And I actually had a reasonable position, but went on to lose that game. So it also felt like a little bit of deja vu to basically be in the same exact situation where my performance rating is right there, but I still need another positive result to, bring it all together. So I was hoping to kind of, right the wrongs of last year, of 2018 rather, and make it happen. So anyways, without further ado, let's get into it. So anyway, Sune opened with d4. He's actually a very, very flexible player. Plays e4, d4, c4, knight f3, and actually makes him very, very difficult to prepare against. So I didn't spend too much time, preparing all these different lines because I knew he had a lot of options. And so I just, my priority was really to just try and, play fairly quickly and see what happens after that. So anyways, after d4, I went d5, and then after c4, e6, and then knight f3 was played, and I actually went knight f6. Not always what I had been doing against knight f3 type setups. I had gone a6 in the past on move 3, playing for my e6, d5, a6, queen's gambit nuances. But here this actually invites the Catalan, and unfortunately I maybe should have spent a little bit more time on this because he actually went g3 very quickly, and this actually makes a lot of sense because g3 is a very challenging move to face the Catalan, and typically white has a nice enduring edge that's quite nagging. And actually, if I'm going to be totally honest with myself, my results in the Catalan have been less than stellar. If you've seen some of the games in the Road to Grandmaster series, whether it's a game against Gauri Shankar from earlier this year, or a game against David Burchess, also from on this channel, I've just struggled to really play good games against the Catalan, so it was really a good choice. So after g3, I actually thought, you know what, my Catalan games haven't been so hot. Why don't I try to play something that's not quite exactly the typical Catalan setup, and I went for bishop b4 check, which is actually extremely topical at the moment. The idea is actually to disturb white's development in some way. So if the knight goes to d2, then the argument here is that on d2, it's actually not exerting pressure on the d5 pawn as it would be if it was on c3. And so from d2, the pawn is kind of dominating the knight on d2. And many lines actually, after white castles, the computer actually suggests the knight to go back with knight b1 just to relocate to the c3 square. So that's actually one idea behind it. And then the other idea is if they just go knight c3 to block like that, well, you actually try to get greedy and take the pawn and hold on to it with b5 because there's this pin here. So that's actually another point behind it. And then the last, reasonable way you could block bishop d2 is the move that's often employed. And typically the concept here is that the bishop on d2 is actually quite misplaced and really is disturbing the connection between the queen and the in the center and the queenside pawns. And in many lines, the bishop would rather be placed on either f4 or actually on b2. And so typically after bishop d2, there have been thousands of games where the bishop drops back to e7, and the argument is that, black kind of gained a half tempo, disturbing white's development. But after bishop d2, a lot of these lines can be quite theoretical with bishop d2 and bishop e7, and I decided to kind of play something a little bit simpler and way less popular, and it's actually bishop takes d2 check. And the point with bishop takes d2 check is just to trade those dark squared bishops and get a relatively simple position where you castle quickly. But white is actually known to have a slight enduring edge here, and that's kind of what happened, because after knight takes d2, which was played, I castled, and then white played bishop g2. And basically, this is kind of one of the first critical positions of the game, because essentially, what does black have for the early bishop exchange? Well, for starters, he did, I guess maybe gets rid of some of the pressure that sometimes happens on the c7 pawn when a dark square bishop comes to f4. But on the flip side, black's actually theoretically left with the quote-unquote bad light squared bishop, whereas the white bishop on g2 really has potential on the long diagonal to really exert some pressure. So it appears that, white's actually just a little bit comfortable. But in general, the concepts that black is going to be going for is trying to play against this knight on d2, and in some lines actually trying to play c5 relatively quickly based upon the fact that this knight is still on d2 and not actually on c3, where it's exerting real pressure on the d5 square. So actually the best way for black to actually play here is actually to go knight bd7. And then after a white would castle, to actually go b6 and try to play b6, bishop b7, and c5. And in my opinion, that's probably the best way, or the best chance that black has to equalize. Now, white does have some opportunities here. White can, go b4 and try to discourage c5. There's also c takes d5, changing the structure drastically and arguing that after rook c1 that there's legitimate pressure on the c pawn, and maybe even, playing against the hanging pawns if black insists on playing c5 anyway. And in these positions, white is slightly better, but black does have relatively active pieces once the bishop comes to b7, and it's no harm, no foul. Unfortunately for me, I kind of mixed up my ideas. I was vaguely familiar with some of these ideas, but instead of knight bd7, I actually went for the move c6. And this move is a huge mistake, even though it's actually been played dozens of times, even by some decent grandmasters. And the real issue is that black actually isn't in time to get in the setup with knight bd7, b6, and bishop b7 in this particular version of the position. And so it's actually just not very good. And so let's see why in a moment. So after c6, white now castled, and I went knight bd7, and then Sune played queen c2. And this is essentially the issue with this structure, is that white is already threatening to play e4, and this Catalan expansion with e4 secures white a very, very favorable position, and actually it's especially enduring given the fact that this bishop on c8 is the bad bishop, and that after this diagonal opens, the bishop on g2 would be the one that would be dominant. So in addition to this knight on f3 being more active than the knight on d7, white would also, just be coming through in the center very, very effectively. And note also that white's rooks are already connected. So basically, because e4 is such a significant threat, this position just doesn't really work. And there actually are positions where white plays e4, and actually black doesn't take on e4 and actually allows e5. But in those versions of the setup, it's actually really important that black has his dark squared bishop on e7, because it's actually an important defensive piece that covers important squares on the king side and provides counterplay on the queen side with a potential c5 break. And that potential dynamic is just non-existent with the dark square bishops off the board. So this is actually a much worse version of positions in the Catalan that I've actually played earlier this year, and that's especially unfortunate. So actually e4 is a really legitimate threat now, and there's really not much I can do with it, so I kind of just have to, keep playing. And I actually told myself here, this is probably one of the worst positions I can get out of the opening, given the circumstances. But I had a resolve to kind of say, you know what, I'm not going to be, down on the board and on the clock. So I decided my best chance would actually be to play as quickly as possible, frankly, to just force white to make, difficult decisions under the gun. And maybe if I had to force white to make enough difficult decisions, eventually he'd make a bad one. And so I actually decided to play quite quickly from here, given, how poorly the opening had turned out. And I very quickly played the move b6. The idea of b6 is just to, develop my bishop, put it somewhere on maybe b7 or a6, but I have to try and connect my rooks expeditiously. So that was the idea there. Now after b6, white played e4, and again, you can just see that now white has everything he wants in the center, really excellent control, and essentially, if I take on e4, after knight takes e4, there's knight d6 as an idea a lot of the time if my bishop comes to b7. And if I take on e4 after queen takes e4, bishop b7, this is just going to be a real torture. Even after a move like knight e5, this type of endgame with knight takes e5, d takes e5, is just going to be extremely unpleasant in the long run, and probably just losing, actually, because the rook comes to d1, then maybe it even anchors itself on d6, and the bishop on b7 is pinned, and these factors make it extremely difficult. So, for instance, let's say I go queen e7, rook d1, threatening rook d6 and doubling on the d6 square. So I have to go probably rook d8, and now. Yeah, I mean, you can just see here that I can never play c5 because the bishop on b7 is hanging, and it's just very, very difficult to really defend this. Now, I mean, white has a few plans to improve. White can play a3 and b4 is one idea, and then try to maybe play c5 at some point. White can also try to play h4 and h5 and squeeze that way. Also, f4 is an option. There are just a lot of really decent options, actually, and white is better. So, yeah, definitely sort of like a nightmare scenario that I really did not want to allow. So instead, I decided that the lesser evil was actually allowing e5, but of course, white's going to have an advantage there as well. So after e4, I actually went bishop b7, allowing e5. But I felt that was kind of my best chance to just ensure that the knight on d2 did not get into the game. So e5 was played, and now in this position, it's actually been played about a dozen times, and there were most of the games here actually featured knight e8, but I'd actually had a game with knight e8 in the structure against Gauri Shankar with the dark squared bishops on the board with my bishop on e7 and I think his bishop on c1 still. And I just felt like the knight on e8 is a lot of times stuck there, and I thought it's a little bit better on g4 in some lines, because if it can somehow reroute itself to f5, almost like a knight in the French, it sometimes can actually have some play. And so I actually played knight g4. And again, this is not the best move. Knight e8 is actually more favored more by the engines, but I'd actually had a game with knight g4 in a hybrid Catalan type of a closed Catalan type of setup in the Reykjavik Open. I can recall against the Brazilian Grandmaster Alexander Fier, and that game actually went quite decently for me. So this knight g4 idea I did know was something I could do, and I thought that, given that it's so rare, it's something that the concept's very rare. It's something that maybe would slow Sune back down a little bit. So that was the idea there. Now, after knight g4, rook fe1 was played, and now actually we're in completely new territory as far as games are concerned. I don't think there have been any more games from this position. I don't really love rook fe1. It is certainly a playable move, but I just don't find it to be the most incisive. I think there are other opportunities in the position that could have given white even more direct play. One of them is actually just h4. The idea is that you just put the knight on g5, and some lines, just queen takes h7 mate isn't a very important threat and difficult to deal with. And if black has to play a move like g6 to negate the pressure of the queen on this diagonal, it just means that there are going to be more dark squares that are weakened and more potential targets in my position. So not really a desirable move to make, and that's why it's quite unpleasant to face. Another direct option is actually playing c takes d5 right away. And this is actually a concept that is quite typical in these structures, to actually take on d5 with the pawn, so that black actually has to recapture on d5 with the pawn. Because in a dream scenario, black would love to have a knight on d5, but that never really winds up happening. Many lines, when the knight is on e8, c takes d5 happens before the knight can actually arrive on c7 to reinforce the d5 pawn. And the concept here is that after c takes d5, now rook fc1 already exploits the pressure on the c file, and queen c7 becomes an idea. And even if black does kick the queen off of the c file with rook c8, now the white queen just assumes another nice post on a4, challenging the a7 pawn, still retaining pressure on the c file, and just making it very difficult for black to really consolidate. Note that rook fc1 was the important move, because now the bishop on f1 is freed to kind of wreak havoc on the light squares, either b5 or a6, that may come under fire. So for instance, if I play a6 to cover the a pawn, now bishop f1 already eyes the pawn on a6. Might not necessarily threaten to win the pawn, because there is rook a8 sometimes with a pin, but it does threaten the pawn in some lines later. So yeah, a little bit more incisive, but rook fe1 still does, preserve a serious white edge. I now went knight h6, trying to essentially reroute my knight to f5. I thought it made sense to do this before white played h3 and g4 potentially, or even just before he kicked my knight away. An argument could be made that I should have just kept my knight here, because as long as it's there, at least it kind of goads white into playing h3 and g4 to lock my knight out of the f5 square, and maybe I could have spent that time doing something somewhere else. Where, might you say, I should spend that time? Well, the computer suggests playing c5. This actually makes some sense, because as I mentioned before, black really would prefer to take on d5 with a piece rather than a pawn, and this might actually give black much needed counterplay on the queen side, given the stranglehold on the king side and in the center. But here, white still has an edge after d takes c5, b takes c5, and c takes d5, because if you play e takes d5, the king side's a little bit too loose, f5 is too sensitive, e6 becomes a possibility, and so you really need to take bishop takes d5, and now the pawn c5 and a7 are split, And so even though the bishop on d5 is a nice outpost, white still has a advantage based upon the pawn structure and also based upon the connected rooks and the weak d6 square. And now white can go in for knight c4 and really post up quite conveniently on that square, add more pressure to the position, reinforce the e5 pawn with knight c4 as well, d6, and just a comfortable edge here for white. Although, given some of the positions in the game, this is certainly a more active position than I had for pretty much most of the game, so this would have been preferred. So anyways, instead, after knight h6, white played c takes d5, and I think this is actually really smart because he's basically not giving me another chance to get that c5 move in. I was kind of entertaining knight f5 and then c5, where it seems like I'm getting everything to kind of pressure and unravel the white center. And now playing c takes d5, he kind of shuts that down, and after c takes d5, you can see my bishop on b7 is very dormant, and white is going to have some pressure on the c-file, and I'm not going to really manufacture any pressure against d4 with just the knight on f5. So, pretty good move. After c takes d5, white played rook ac1, and you basically can see here, again, why this position is so troublesome. Again, the c7 square is sensitive. White does have control of the c-file for now. Also, because of the absence of the dark square bishops, I cannot say this enough, my bishop on e7 would be patrolling these important dark squares, d6, b4, sometimes a3, and that's just not happening here. So I also have, these squares to contend with, and that makes it very difficult. And so I first challenged on the c-file by playing rook c8, just pushing the queen away from c7. But now after queen a4, I have new problems because a7 is sensitive, and that needs to be dealt with. And so I went a6 to deal with that. I thought this was more sensible than going a5 because as I'd actually learned in my game against Gauri Shankar from earlier this year in the Road to Grandmaster series, but when you play a5, b5 is basically weakened forever. And white often actually has a really nice plan of either going bishop f1 and bishop b5, or sometimes even knight b1, knight a3 or knight c3, and then knight b5. And if white gets a minor piece on this square, it's just unassailable because the pawns are, not where they should be. So I played a6 just to cover the b5 square as well as defend the pawn. But now we can see why the absence of bishops are so important, in particular the one on e7, because now white went bishop f1, first eyeing the a6 pawn, but in a future move actually having the opportunity to go queen a3 and actually eye these dark squares. So that's pretty much the gist of the issue. So anyways, after bishop f1, the a6 pawn is targeted a second time, and I thought here that I really shouldn't play the move b5 because I thought if I play b5 after queen a3, I thought that not only is this diagonal now sensitive, the dark squares adjacent to the b5 push are also sensitive, and I thought this knight now would rush over to a5 and really, invade the position with decisive effect. So because of that, I didn't want to play b5 and give that knight on d2 life. And so after bishop f1, I actually went knight f5. But And now bishop d3 was played, challenging my knight on f5. But actually, I just want to point out, instead of knight f5, a better move would have actually been knight b8. And the point is with knight b8 is that I actually defend the a6 pawn, again, very importantly, and I give myself the opportunity to potentially go queen e7 or queen d7 and connect my rooks, which is extremely important here. My chances for survival will essentially rest upon whether or not I can trade enough pieces to alleviate the pressure in my position, because essentially there's a scenario where nearly all the pieces are on the board and I'm really lacking space. And when you lack space, you want to trade minor pieces. So I really do need to execute some trades under favorable circumstances. So anyways, after knight f5 and bishop d3, Now I actually went knight e7 because I thought it was kind of important to pull that knight away from f5, because I thought bishop takes f5 might be a positional threat. But you can see here now my knight is kind of entombing my queen. I still don't have any squares to connect my rook, so all is not rosy. And now queen a3 was played. Very, very effective move. You can see d6 is being eyed as a potential invasion square. And yeah, white is still significantly for choice. After queen a3, I went knight c6. And the idea here was now to get the queen to e7 and introduce some trades, hopefully, and kind of simplify the position. And also in some lines, I thought knight a5 might be valuable, being able to reroute my knight to a5, maybe to c4. But knight c6, believe it or not, is actually a losing move. And fortunately for me, my opponent did not see why knight c6 was losing. So why don't you pause the video and try to figure out for yourself why this move actually loses. All right, so hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and figure out why knight c6 is so troublesome. Before I show you what the better move is, before I show you the solution, I should say knight b8 is much better, just guarding the a6 pawn, and basically it's consistent with the move previously, where I really do need to go knight b8 to cover that pawn. The reason knight c6 is losing is actually because of bishop takes a6. And believe it or not, this rook a8 idea that I was kind of hanging my hat on, this pin on the bishop on a6, doesn't actually matter, because if I play rook a8 now, white can actually just go queen takes f8 check. That probably deserves an exclamation point. And the point is that after knight takes f8, or really any way you take, but knight takes f8 is the best way, now bishop takes b7. And right now, white has a rook, a pawn, and a bishop for the queen. So he already has material equality, and you can see the knight and the rook are skewered. So now white is going to get interest for that queen. So he already has material equality, he's going to get more. And I need to basically jettison the knight. So if I go knight takes d4, that's the best way I can do that. But after knight takes d4 and rook takes a2, I do get two pawns. But now there is just a huge issue because my knight on f8 is passive. All of white's pieces are reasonably active. And actually, knight c6 just wins on the spot because the queen is actually almost trapped. It really is lacking squares on this on the back rank. Note that c6 is not possible. b8 is not possible. a6 is covered. All these squares are covered. And if you go queen c7, then knight b4 wins the rook. So that would be easily winning, having two rooks and a knight for the queen. That would be decisive advantage. So I can't go to c7. So the only reasonable square is actually d7. But from d7, actually, there's the move bishop c8. And it's just devastating, but the geometry here is just really in white's favor. Again, all these squares are covered by white. And so queen e8 is really the only way. And now white can just go knight f3, bring this other knight to d4, and just have positional domination. And this rook now can probably invade on a1 if possible. Again, note that the queen takes c8 is not possible because knight e7 check is a big-time fork. And the position is actually just completely winning for white. Because this queen is hardly acting like a queen. It's extremely passive and not really getting anything in the position. So yeah, so it actually turns out that the a6 pawn was hanging and could be captured, and that tactical sequence with queen takes f8 would be decisive. So fortunately for me, after knight c6, bishop takes a6 was not seen in conjunction with queen takes f8, and that gave me, more life because in this position, white actually played bishop b1. And the position still remains firmly in white's favor. White still has a space advantage. I'm still, not really getting anything in the position right now, but I can live to fight more moves, and I can still try and play on the queen side now that the bishop has vacated this diagonal. Now, I will say during the game, I also did not see this bishop takes a6 and queen takes f8 idea, so it was missed by both of us. But bishop b1 introduces new themes. Again, now that the f6 square has been taken away from my knight, queen d3 is always a huge idea, just kind of entertaining mating threats on that diagonal. And I really don't want to have to play g6 because, again, the dark squares f6 and h6 would be extremely sensitive. And I'd almost be creating a hook for white to potentially go h4, h5. There have been versions of this position where white can go h4, king g2, rook h1, and then very quickly bring the rook and a knight to g5 and just, basically kill you with decisive effect. So really was not trying to have any of that, and that's why after bishop b1, I actually went rook e8. And the idea was that after h4 or even queen d3, which are both possible, the idea was actually to bring my knight to f8 so that I can cover the h7 square without incurring more weaknesses by pushing my pawns. And again, this is something that I have preached on this channel, is when you already have a few weaknesses, it's usually better just to kind of stick with those and begrudgingly defend without creating any more. Because the more weaknesses you create, the more opportunities there are for your opponent to kind of capitalize on them. And so that was kind of my mindset, is don't play g6 if you don't have to. So after h4, I actually went queen e7, and I took the liberty to finally connect my rooks. It's basically move 20, and we basically have a scenario where I finally connect my rooks, where white has had this scenario for a long time. So definitely just another sign of why this position has really not gone well for me. But I'm still trying to fight, and at least now I'm managing to control the squares on this diagonal, and my queen side didn't collapse, right? That was essentially the risk 5 to 6 moves ago, was white was so far ahead after c takes d5 that it really did seem like white was going to crash through on the queen side, and amazingly white didn't. So I kind of survived the first wave, and now I'm actually playing a move with tempo, because surely here white isn't really interested in trading queens here and kind of helping me out to consolidate. Note that if you play queen takes e7, rook takes e7, white isn't worse or anything, but I definitely now would take the opportunity to move my knight, play rook ec7, and really start to try and begin some trading operations. So anyways, after queen e7, white played queen d3, threatening this checkmate on h8. And I played knight f8 to cover the h7 pawn. And I'm barely holding on, but I am holding on. White now went a3, which does make some sense, trying to cover the b4 square. This was always going to be a source of counterplay for me once the rooks were connected, was to play knight b4, harass the queen, chase it off of this diagonal, and then try to trade the rooks. Does that make sense? But now when you play a3, actually, the b3 square is just a little bit more sensitive than it was a move ago, and that's something to keep in mind. So I actually was already considering knight a5 as a potential move to try and get at some of these weakened light squares, or kind of the business squares on the queen side I could play with. Now after a3, I actually played h6. In part because I was a little bit wary of knight g5 coming. I do recognize here with h6 I'm creating a hook, and I did take that quite seriously, but I thought it was actually kind of important to do this to defend prophylactically against knight g5. Now the reason knight g5 wasn't an idea in the previous position is because I had knight b4. So I can actually chase the queen off this diagonal before knight takes h7 is a problem, and then if the queen moves, now I can go h6 and no harm, no foul. But after a3, I thought that knight g5 was actually a serious threat, and so I actually decided to slow down on knight a5 just to deal with that. It actually turns out that knight a5 right away is actually better, and the idea is that after knight g5, I actually can still play h6. Now, I was concerned that I would have to go g6 here, but in part because of the move knight h7. I actually thought here knight h7 would be extremely strong and effective, because now white's threatening to just trade the knights and then come in with the queen. And note that I can't play a move like g6 still, because knight f6 check would be a fork. But amazingly here, it actually turns out that after knight h7, I can actually go knight d7. And there's no direct way in this position that white can cash in and try and get the queen to h7 cleanly. For instance, if you go knight g5 back, I actually can go knight f8 and defend the square again, which is kind of a funny looking repetition. And if you go knight f6 check, I actually can play knight takes f6, which temporarily covers h7. And then after e takes f6, I can go queen takes f6. And there's one check, and there's even a second check, but that's it. And there's actually no way for white to really, make hay with the king getting out to e7. So actually, I did not need to play h6, but I think from a human perspective, h6 seems a lot more natural, and I think you guys can perhaps understand why I did it. So anyways, after h6, white now went knight h2, and I actually think this is a step in the wrong direction. Now, I do understand why the move was played. Now that I've created this hook, I think white did want to maybe penetrate on h6 or potentially f6 and, just get that knight to some of those squares. Maybe in some lines, f4 is also a consideration. I don't know. But this move just takes the attention a little bit away from the center and gives me a little bit of counterplay in the interim. And I thought this was in my favor, because now I jumped at the opportunity to play knight a5. Now, instead of knight h2, in my opinion, moves that prevented knight a5 would have been a little bit more sensible. So b4 is one concept that actually, just stops knight a5. Now, in this position, I could go knight a7 and try to still, get my knight in somewhere and play on some of these squares. But I think, not allowing knight a5 is nice. Another way to do that is actually play knight b3. This, definitely stops knight a5, because I really don't want to play knight a5 and double these pawns. Although, maybe it'd be playable, but it just doesn't look super attractive. And so those moves, I think, make a little bit more sense. Knight h2 just allows knight a5. And now I'm actually, trying to get some pieces off the board, get some counterplay, maybe play b5 and knight c4. Who knows? So in this position, white actually played knight g4, just kind of ignoring what I was trying to do on the queen side. And I really did have to respect white's ideas here, because now the knight on g4, sacrifices on h6 are stuff I really have to be concerned about. So if I'm, basically slow and not really alert, white can very easily go queen e3 and then sack on h6, probably with decisive effect, because then, the bishop would still be bearing down this diagonal, the queen would be on h6. There would just be a lot of energy on the king side, and I probably wouldn't survive that with just one lone defender, that knight on f8. So that is something I have to respect. And because I realized that, queen e3 is a potential move, I thought I need to be faster than, trying to play b5 and knight c4. Even playing rook takes c1 and rook c8, it just seemed a little bit too mechanical. So I decided to play the most energetic looking move, and it was the move knight c4. And the idea with knight c4 is that not only am I attacking the b2 pawn and also challenging the knight on d2, I'm also preventing the queen from getting to e3, which is really the dark square. That this diagonal is really the one it wants to get to entertain those sacrifices. And so I thought this was really clever, and I thought it was really the moment to do this. I actually was up about 40 or 50 minutes on the clock. Again, I'd been playing extremely quickly since right before the move e4. So since queen c2, right after queen c2, I started to play extremely fast, because I thought that was the path forward in this game, was to make them solve problems under pressure. And I knew at some juncture time could become a factor. And now, just at the moment where it seems like white is going to smoothly, convert or get some initiative on the king side, I create some confusion, some chaos that is a unwelcome distraction, if you will. So after knight c4, white really needs to decide what to do. White actually took on c4, and I played d takes c4, and this I was happy with, because even though I'm a pawn down now, all of a sudden this bishop on b7, which was dead, which was absolutely dormant the entire game, all of a sudden is super active on a diagonal that cannot be shut down meaningfully. And so I thought, you know what, this is something I can work with. And after d takes e4, rook takes e4, rook takes, and queen takes, it's my move, and I am a pawn down, but you can see my bishop is now playing on a long diagonal, and the extra pawn that white has, this d pawn, is a potential target. It is technically a backward pawn, I would say, because it's pretty decently blockaded by my bishop and my e pawn, and so it's really not the biggest pawn in the world that could really brought a lot of fear to my eyes, so to speak. And after queen takes d4, I actually played the move queen d7. And you could see here, I already have a few different ideas. The queen and bishop battery on the long diagonal is a potential idea. The rook coming to c8 to challenge on the one open file is also a decent idea. And so as long as white is not going to kind of checkmate me on the king side, this is actually a position where white has some, short-term and kind of long-term problems to wrestle with, because black will have counterplay based upon the activity of the remaining pieces. So I thought, this gives me actually really, really excellent chances here, and is really the best position I've had pretty much from the jump. So very, very happy to get this one. So after queen d7, white actually went knight e3. And this move makes sense from a theoretical perspective. You actually control the d5 square so that I can't firmly blockade it with a piece. And in some lines, if I try to get the battery in, d5 might actually be an option, shutting down the battery and forcing me to recapture with the e-pawn. But once the knight moves away from e3, my king can breathe a bit of a sigh of relief, because I can see now my pawns are not going to be chopped off. There's not going to be any knight sacrifices pending. And so that was something that I was kind of happy to see. Also, you're kind of inviting rook c8 with tempo, so I was kind of cool with that. Instead, queen b4 would have been more challenging. The point is that you attack the b6 pawn, and you kind of, force me to go b5, because if I go queen c6, there's always bishop e4 here, and trading these bishops really would extinguish a lot of the counterplay I have in the position. And let's say queen c7, after bishop takes, queen takes, now rook c1, it's white that's controlling the c file, and still a pawn up in this position with a lot of play. So this would be something that's not what I want. So I would have to play a move like b5 here, and now this would actually be somewhat of a concession for me, because now white has gained some other squares in the queen side. Potentially c5 and a5 are squares that white can take advantage of. But more importantly, after b5, now white can actually go queen d2. And the point is, white actually got a tempo attacking the b pawn, and now shifts back towards the king side, where those menacing sacrifices with knight h6 and knight f6 look possible. And I actually have to be extremely careful here not to just lose the game on the spot. A move that looks extremely natural to me is actually the move rook d8, just challenging the d4 pawn. Not going queen d5 again, because bishop e4 just hits the queen and the bishop on this battery. But I think attacking the d4 pawn seems nice, because if the rook moves, then queen d5 comes in with decisive effect. But it actually turns out that rook d8 is actually losing, because knight f6 is actually just a winning move. The point is that after g takes f6, which was forced because the king and queen were forked. Now e takes f6 is just decisive, and queen takes h6, queen g7 is actually mate. And you might say, oh, well, what about this battery with queen d5? Well, again, queen d5 just runs into bishop e4, and this skewer is a problem. So I can't actually, if I go back, then you can see there's mate on g7. And, of course, if I try to stop that mate by going like queen h5, well, white just picks up the piece on b7 and has a winning advantage here. So, yeah, so basically this queen d2, again, this knight h6, knight f6 threat with the queen on the dark squares is actually extremely potent. And actually turns out here that the best move is a move that is kind of difficult to spot. It's actually move bishop a8. And the point is that in many lines, the bishop on a8 is actually protected. So when you play a move like queen b7, you're actually, or queen d5, you're actually not losing material because the rook is covering the bishop on a8. So for instance, if knight f6 check now, after g takes f6, e takes f6, and queen d5 like before, bishop e4 can now be met with queen h5, and the point is that the rook is actually defending the bishop on a8, so black remains a piece up. But that's a tricky nuance to kind of spot, in your calculations. It'd be a tough one to see, in my opinion. So because knight f6 doesn't work after bishop a8, white would probably need to improve the position another way. One way to do that is actually h5, trying to just put more of a clamp on black's kingside pawns, and again, maybe sometimes the sacrifice can be entertained. And now black would actually need to play rook c8 to try to get some counterplay and hold this one. And again, the position still remains devilishly complicated. These types of sacrifices still remain on the cards if black's not alert. And the real problem here is this knight on f8 is quite passive. So that knight, is purely a defensive piece right now and really would love to be something more. So, yeah. So anyways, instead of queen b4, knight e3 was played. And this actually allowed me to go b5. And the reason b5 is actually a good move here is because in previous scenarios, the queen was coming to this diagonal and from either d2 or e3, and there were sacrifices on h6 or g7. And here, there's no such thing because the knight actually backed up. So my king's actually more secure than it was before. So actually, b5 is a great move. And the reason I preferred b5 to move like rook c8 was because if I play rook c8 right away, I thought the queen can go to d3, and I really wanted to challenge with queen c6 or potentially even rook d8 attacking the d4 pawn. So I didn't want the rook on c8 right away. So I thought b5 was more sensible. After b5, white actually played queen d3, but a stronger move would actually have been queen c3. The point is that after rook c8, queen d3, and then rook d8, it actually would be white to move in this circumstance, and it's not entirely, white couldn't essentially defend this position quite reasonably. Rook d1 becomes an option as well. But the position's nearly transposed because what wound up happening was after b5, queen d3 was played, and now I actually went queen c6, and this was where I took my chance. The point is now, with the queen no longer on the c-file, actually, my queen can actually get here and threaten mate on h1. And this is, I think, a move that, or sequence that Sune missed. So actually, if we back up for a moment, that's actually why queen c3 would have been more critical, because now if with the rook on c8, now if I insist on playing queen c6 here, white actually has the move d5, and it's extremely effective here because after e takes d5, knight f5 threatens a family fork on e7, and that actually means that white would retain the advantage because in addition to knight e7 being a threat, knight d6 is also an idea, challenging the bishop on b7, and you could see this battery, to the king side's just a dream that's not going to happen anymore. So actually really important to actually play queen c3 instead of queen d3, because now after queen d3 and queen c6, d5 is actually not as strong as before. Now, white could play king h2. This was not played. d5 was actually played. But if king h2, I actually could just go queen f3. And I am not giving mate, but I do have a lot of counterplay here. And after queen e2, defending the f2 pawn, now I can actually go rook d8 and challenge on d4. And this is the type of position I was talking about where, white's extra pawn is really a backward d pawn. And, a pawn is a pawn. It's still important. But after queen takes f3, bishop takes f3, it's quite clear that I'm extremely active here. My rook is hitting d4. The bishop is, really nicely wedged in white's camp. The rook can't come to d1 and defend the pawn. So the only way you can actually defend d4 is knight c2. And that's extremely passive, blocking the bishop on b1. And now I can improve my position further with a move like g5. And you can see here that this knight is actually going to get somewhere where it challenges the d4 pawn or gets some counterplay on the queen side. So black really would not have too much to fear, even though white is still a pawn up. So I think Sune saw some of these details and was, kind of shaking his head here. He realized that something had went wrong in the past few moves, that he allowed this counterplay on the battery. And after queen c6, he kind of rushed into playing d5. Part of the reason for this was actually he was down to his last 5 minutes or so, and I actually had like 50 minutes on my clock before move 40 because I was playing so quickly. And after d5, the difference here is that after e takes d5, because my rook is still on e8, knight f5 is not a decisive looking threat, threatening this family fork type of stuff. So in this position, I'm actually can get away with playing d4 next and reinforcing these mating ideas. Now, another thing to keep in mind is white actually can't shut down the diagonal with a move like queen d4 because there's knight e6. And I forced that diagonal open with d4 because the queen, as we should know, is the worst blockading piece imaginable. It's just terrible. It never is effective because it's the most valuable. So it has to move, and when the queen moves, then I have d4 as an option. Note that queen h7 is no longer mate. I do have an escape square on e7, so I can just kind of run away here, funnily enough. So anyways, after e takes d5, knight f5 was played, trying to blockade with the knight on d4. And that's why I insisted now on playing d4 myself before that blockade could happen, happily giving up that pawn to reinforce these mating ideas on h1 and g2. After d4, f3 has to be played. It's the only move that prevents the queen from infiltrating. And for a second here after d4, I actually thought, do I have winning possibilities here? Am I gonna give mate? And once I saw f3, I started to calm down. I was like, hold on, there's nothing winning here. But I have done a really good job to kind of survive what had seemed like it was a terrible, terrible losing position for me. So after f3, I took on f3, queen takes. And after queen takes f3, bishop takes f3, lo and behold, I'm temporarily up a pawn. And I actually have a better pawn structure because in this circumstance, I actually have, well, let's just say knight takes d4 is played here. And in this position, I actually have 2 pawn islands and white has 3. And so the e-pawn is potentially a target. After knight takes d4, I had to figure out where to go with my bishop. And I actually did spend about 5 or 6 minutes here just kind of soaking in what had happened over the last 5 to 10 moves, because it was just a startling transformation, even for me, to go from a position where I'm really groveling to a position where I'm finally kind of stabilized. And so I kind of just wanted to kind of relax, not screw things up very quickly. And I had the time to do so, and I wanted to figure out which square was the most effective for my bishop and what ideas were remaining in the white position. As far as I could see, the e-pawn was a target, but I also thought that white might try to play e6 if allowed, and I thought that the square that the bishop on b1 was really looking at was probably a2 to try and, entertain e6 and just pressure the king on this diagonal. So I decided to play bishop d5. And I really, really like this move because in addition to taking away this diagonal from the light squared bishop, I also kind of dominate the knight a little bit so that it can't really, encroach in a lot of squares in the position. So I thought that was actually the really best place to put it. And the computers actually agree. And after bishop d5, Sune actually was really frustrated. Obviously, he's down to his last 4 or 5 minutes. And it's, again, now black can actually follow up with a move like knight d7, just attacking the e5 pawn. And, black's kind of okay now. And so now white actually played bishop e4 and actually offered a draw. I thought for a little bit, just because, I wanted to check and see that there wasn't, any winning possibilities here. Right away, you just want to check. You just do a sanity check and just look, is e5 hanging? Well, no, e5 is not hanging because bishop h7 check, and that's a way to lose the game and lose the exchange. So that's not possible. And then, yeah, the bishops would need to come off the board. So I could take the bishops, and then maybe I can go, knight e6 or rook d8. And, black is not worse. Maybe black's even a tiny bit better because of the pawn structure. But black's not winning either, and I thought, you know what, this draw is exactly what I was aiming for from move 1, really. It was a draw to get my GM norm. And so, I thought for a minute or two, and then, of course, I accepted. And with this game, I actually secured my second Grandmaster norm. Sune was extremely disgusted with himself. He was gracious enough to, congratulate me on my second GM norm, but he was really, not. He didn't want to analyze it all. He didn't want to really talk about the game. It is what it is, and yeah, I basically was elated because, my gosh, this was such a difficult road in terms of the tournament, such a difficult journey. In this tournament, I played 6 GMs that were 2,600 plus. Well, actually, I think technically 5 because Sune at the time was just below 2,600, so he's like 2,550, 2,560. But basically played 6 GMs, 2,600 plus, and yeah, I managed to only lose one of those games, and I really showed some good chess in this one, and just to sort of, after the game, I obviously, found my grandfather who was playing in the tournament. As you may have known, I mentioned that in round 1 that my grandfather does play in this one, and he was actually still playing. But after his game finished, I told him I got it, and I drew, and I got the GM norm, and we drove back home, and I was just so excited. It was honestly one of the happiest moments of my life. If you've ever seen Pursuit of Happiness, there's a scene at the end of the movie where Will Smith actually gets the job. He'd been doing this unpaid internship essentially for a long time to try and become a broker at this firm, and then finally on the last day, they tell him to wear a suit to work tomorrow because it's going to be his first day. And that scene actually always brings me to tears. And quite honestly, after the game, when I was back at my grandparents' house FaceTiming my mom back and my grandma back in America, and talking to some people and just telling my mom what had happened, I was really brought to tears because, well, it even gets me going now just talking about it because I've worked so hard for this moment, and it's been a hard road. You've seen the games. You've seen all these games I've shown on this channel. I don't know what video number this is. I believe this is probably game 123 in the Road to Grandmaster series. So that's obviously a lot of games, a lot of losses to get to that point, and just a lot of ups and downs. And I've also I've experienced health problems through it all, and just to persevere and to fight and to believe and to not give up is something that I really want. I hope to inspire in some of the people following this channel, is that you really have to stay vigilant and continue to fight for the things you believe in, because they're important. They're important because they're important to you. So anyways, I also got the best game prize for this tournament for my win in round 4 against Moisenko, and now I can actually properly celebrate. And yeah, I did celebrate for a few days, and then I was back at it. So anyways, thanks for watching this video. Thanks for following the tournament and this journey, and it's not over. There's still one more GM norm to get, and I still need to get to 2,500, which is actually just as difficult, one may argue, because GM norms are about being brilliant, about playing at a 2,600 level 3 times in your life, but getting to 2,500 is really about consistency, and that's something that has been a challenge for me thus far. So that's something that I continue to work on, and yeah, but for now, I'll take that GM norm and keep it moving. All right, thanks for watching. That's it for this one. Please like and/or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation in the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.